Welcome. Today is the 3rd of February, 2015, the Feast of St. Blaise. Hope you all got your throats blessed. And we are joined today by Rick Delano, the executive producer of the movie The Principle, which can be best to be described as a movie scrutinizing the Copernican principle. Excuse me. Thank you for joining us today, Rick. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. Good to meet you face to face after all this time.
Same here. Okay, first, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to the Catholic faith and how you got into film.
Well, I was one of those guys who was either going to find the Catholic Church or certainly go to hell. I was 20 years in the music business, hopeless, absolutely hopeless, and God made a miraculous intervention into my life through the means of the scriptures, actually. I was convinced by a supernatural grace of the truth of the scriptures, and it took me 10 years from that day to finally figure out what the heck Jesus was talking about when he said, "my church," in Matthew 16. And there's a long story there, but suffice it to say that I was granted supernatural faith. I fell a million times, but I finally found the church, and here I am.
All right. Let's see. Science says, and we've all heard that, and then we're expected to react. It's true, because science said it. The guys in the white coat said it, therefore that's now reality. And what we know that science can be wrong. And the best science for thousands of years said that maggots spontaneously generated from meat, until Pasteur, a Catholic, discovered that they actually hatched from microscopic eggs. When Max Planck went into physics, he was told that physics was dead science. We've already discovered everything. There's nothing left. It's just a body of knowledge to be memorized, and that's all. A few decades later, Einstein comes on the scene, and, well, everything got thrown out. So it seems that what Basil the Great said in the Hexameron is again and again verified, that when he recounts all the philosophers from Thales upward, well, why bother refuting them? They're sufficient to refute each other. So,
It's so true. One of the things that is crucially important to anyone who views the principle is that this question of our place in the cosmos is the greatest detective story in the history of science. And the changes, the 180-degree reversals of the view of the whole human race just over the past few hundred years is so astounding that that story alone is enough to let us know that you should never put all your chips on natural philosophy, because it is not the queen of sciences, and it is actually two domains of knowledge below the queen of sciences. Not to say it's not great, it's wonderful, it's fantastic. I love science, I love cell phones, I love Skype. But let's never confuse that with an autonomous domain of knowledge sufficient to create a consistent and livable Christian worldview.
Excellent. So you're the producer of The Principle, and it's the movie's contention that science is overturning itself yet again on the question of the Copernican principle. So let's start off with how you became involved with producing it and what it's all about.
Well, I became involved by a chance encounter on the internet, must have been 10 years ago now, with some nut who was offering $1,000 to anyone who could provide a direct scientific demonstration of the motion of the Earth around the Sun. And just as it was intended to do, it sucked me right in. And I was immediately fascinated to learn that all of the questions, all the proofs that I had immediately thought of had already been posted and completely demolished. And it was almost like a nightmare in slow motion as I began to suddenly realize that there had never been a direct scientific demonstration of this universally assumed motion of Earth around the Sun. That's how I met Bob Sungenis. Over the next few years, we became friends, and I became deeply involved in about a 2-year-long study of his great book, Galileo Was Wrong. And just about this same time, these puzzling anomalies that the galaxy surveys and the cosmic microwave background surveys, these started to show up in the literature. And all of a sudden, Bob and I said, this is huge. This is absolutely vast. So we started doing pretty extensive research on it. We contacted several of the scientists who ended up being in the film. We did our homework very extensively and carefully. And in about 2010, we decided that these observations had reached the stage of scientific credibility where we had to do this film. And starting 2011, we went into production.
Excellent. So the movie is not per se a geocentrist movie. And I've seen it, and everyone else who's seen it can certainly agree to that it's more like a dialogue with modern science.
It is indeed, and that choice was made for a couple of reasons. There is a fascinating movie to be made about geocentrism, don't doubt it. It would be a absolutely great film. But this is not that film. And the reason this is not that film is that all of us have grown up in a world where the ubiquity of the assumption that Earth is nothing special, that it's a planet going around a sun, and the sun's nothing special, and the galaxy's nothing special. This is a litany that is so deeply inculcated that before you can even say the G word, I mean, if you want to see heads explode, just say the G word. Before you can go there, you have to establish that the fundamental assumption of the modern worldview, the Copernican principle, is now under the gravest imaginable direct observational challenge, and in my personal opinion, has already been rendered false. And the implications of this for science and for our worldview is immense. The atheist scientist who attacks the film so much because he knows what he said on camera, Lawrence Krauss, actually said in 2005, could this be Copernicus coming back to haunt us? Well, in fact, it is. And that's why this film is causing such a controversy out there.
Let's start by defining some terms. So what exactly is geocentrism as opposed to, say, heliocentrism? And moreover, what's the predominant system in cosmology today? Because you find that people would just assume, well, no, obviously heliocentrism is the way to go. But if we understand that term correctly, that's actually not the case.
Well, that's exactly right. Nobody's a heliocentrist in the classical sense of the term. There are very few geocentrists in the classical sense of the term, but they're growing very rapidly right now. Geocentrism in its classical sense is the doctrine that the Earth is motionless with respect to the rest of the universe, that what we see going on, if we look up into the sky, we see the sun going across the sky in the day, and we see the stars going across the sky at night. Geocentrism is simply a what you see is what you get cosmology. We propose that what we are viewing with our sense apparatus is actually what's occurring. And the alternative view, which is by no means heliocentrism, as you pointed out, we are confronted with a cosmology that says that the sun is not the center of anything other than the solar system, and that it in turn, along with us, is going around the center of the galaxy, and the galaxy in turn is going around the center of the great attractor, and in turn we're all going through the CMB. So there's all these motions that are alleged to be occurring, and that what we see when we look up at the sky is an illusion, and that illusion is accounted for by the fact that the Earth is tilted on its axis 23.5 degrees, rotating on its axis once per day, and completing a revolution around the sun once every 365 days. So those are the two fundamental systems you're looking at when you talk about geocentrism versus what isn't really heliocentrism, but I would call standard cosmology.
Okay. Dr. Sungenis, who's the executive producer of the movie, has perhaps become the most well-known proponent of geocentrism with his book Galileo Was Wrong, The Church Was Right. Now, most people are going to be really incredulous about the idea that Galileo could have been wrong, because it's so well ingrained into the culture. So I guess the first question that'll come to the minds of my listeners certainly is, how could so many scientists be so wrong in this question for 400 years?
Well, I think the proper answer to that question is, what on earth would make you think they wouldn't be? The history of science is the successive overturning of things that absolutely everybody on earth was absolutely certain was true. Science, by its very nature, the beauty, the terrible beauty of the scientific method is that it is ceaselessly attempting to overturn what we think we know by crucial scientific test of assumption. That's the beauty of the method. That's why the method must always be informed by the superior knowledge domains of metaphysics and theology, because you are going to interpret what you see in your telescope according to the metaphysical principles that guide the grid through which you will interpret this data. This is one lesson that you will learn immediately in the principle. Everyone agrees on what the telescopes are reporting to us. Hardly anybody agrees on what it means. And that's why you can't do science in a vacuum. You're always going to find that some metaphysical principle seems to explain the data better than another one, and that's when you get a scientific revolution, and we're on the verge of one right now.
So back to this title of Galileo was wrong. The Church has been excoriated since at least the 18th century for condemning Galileo. What scientific arguments did he bring to the table to prove his thesis?
I can tell you, I can save us all a bunch of time. Anyone who has received a postgraduate degree in physics already knows that every single argument Galileo presented to the Inquisition was false at the time it was presented, and is certainly abandoned by every physicist today. They were simply wrong. Bellarmine was very clear. He said, "You have not provided us a demonstration here." And in fact, he hadn't. Even the plausible arguments, I guess the best plausible argument he had was, well, look at the moons of Jupiter. They're not going around the Earth, they're going around the Sun. That has nothing to do with establishing that the Earth is going around the Sun. That is an indication that the moons of Jupiter are going around Jupiter. That has nothing, there's no logical connection at all between that observation and somehow demonstrating that the Earth is going around the Sun. Bellarmine understood this, and of course, once relativity enters the equation, all of Newton's and Galileo's arguments are based on the concept that absolute motion can be detected, that we have a space, an absolute space, and we can sensibly say that this object is moving and that object isn't, and this object is going around and that object isn't. The minute that you adopt relativity, all of those arguments are exploded, gone, over with. Foucault pendulum, completely consistent with either an Earth rotating or a universe rotating. Oblation of the Earth. All of these absolute space-based arguments have been blown up for a century, and essentially nobody knows it. And that's one of the important things that we're going to show them in the principle.
Then, for my listeners, real quick, let's define relativity. We're going to come to Einstein here. What's we hear these terms, we don't really understand what they mean generally. Most of us philosophy majors. What's general relativity versus special relativity?
Okay. The fundamental principle, this philosophical principle that underlies both theories, is that there is no such thing as absolute motion. There is only relative motion. The physics will be the same if you take the Earth as rotating or if you take the universe as rotating. The physical forces that arise on the surface of the Earth will be the same under either thesis. And this is known as the relativity principle. Now, in special relativity, we assume that we can ignore the effects of gravity. If we have two bodies moving together with no acceleration, and they're moving at the same speed and they're not accelerated with respect to one another, relativity says that the speed of light will be constant, will be perceived as being the same for both of those observers. General relativity adds gravity to the mix and says, okay, if we cannot ignore the effects of gravity in our equations, now it's a little different. The speed of light can take any value at all for an observer under the influence of a gravitational field. But the fundamental postulate of reality, the one that creates our worldview, is that everything is relative. There is no absolute frame from which we can say, I'm standing still and that's moving. All you can talk about under the relativity principle is the relative motions between objects.
Okay. So along this line, you just mentioned everything with relativity, that it doesn't matter if the universe is going around the Earth or the Earth is going around its orbit around the Sun, and likewise the Sun in its orbit, the galaxy its orbit, etc. And this is quoted in the film from Einstein, and a lot of people are going to be scratching their heads, say, well, you're using Einstein to argue for geocentrism, but Einstein wasn't a geocentrist. You know, are you trying to make him say something that he doesn't actually say?
The bottom line is that if relativity is true, there is absolutely no difference whatsoever. And think about this, because this is important. If relativity is true, physics cannot distinguish between these two statements. The Earth is going around the Sun and the Sun is at rest, or the Sun is at rest and the Earth is going around the Sun. The Earth is at rest and the Sun is going around the Earth. There's no physical difference between those two statements under the principles of relativity. Now, this is huge. Let's stop and think about that for a second. Now, it is possible, I suppose, that physics might not be able to tell the difference. That's possible. Mm-hmm. But I guarantee you, ontologically, there is one or the other motion happening. Perhaps the answer is not accessible to us through the domain of physics. Perhaps we have to look to higher knowledge domains, metaphysics and theology. But unquestionably, God is able to tell us which is going around which, even if Einstein can't. And I think that that's a crucially important thing to keep.
All right. So then, following this up, for the physicists, that don't believe in God, that aren't looking to higher knowledge, this is still a big problem in accepting the geocentrist argument. So, this is an objection from Dr. Alec McAndrew, who says, because the Earth is unambiguously rotating in Newtonian mechanics, in special relativity, the new geocentrists have been forced to invoke general relativity, which, unfortunately for them, fundamentally undermines the very concepts of static and center, which they're trying to demonstrate. That is what, again, this is a continuous quote, this is what I meant when by the great inconsistency. They're forced to invoke a physical model which renders their claim meaningless, or admit that their claim is wrong. Moreover, Syngenis and many other geocentrists violently reject both special and general relativity. Surely it's deeply inconsistent and illogical to invoke physics in support of their claims that they think is wrong-headed, atheistically motivated, or a product of the author's moral degeneracy. Unquote.
Dr. McAndrew is completely absurd in this objection. The truth is that we are using his own physics to point out his inconsistency. He speaks about Newtonian mechanics. Believe me, Newtonian mechanics is totally irrelevant to the question. Its ability to explain the universe was falsified 100 years and more ago, and he knows it. The issue of special relativity is completely ridiculous. Nobody uses special relativity to attempt to explain cosmology because we have to deal with gravity. So his entire objection is really an insult to the intelligence of the uninformed audience. We talk about general relativity for one reason and one reason only. By the very physics that Dr. McAndrew holds to be true, there is no basis at all to reject geocentrism, because the physics can be done from a frame where the Earth is at rest. Now, he may say that, oh, well, we don't like the idea of anything being at rest. I don't care whether you like it or not. If you cannot physically, by direct experiment, falsify the notion that the Earth is at rest, you have no physical basis to say that geocentrism has been falsified. So I would say that his entire argument is actually a complete red herring.
Mm-hmm. So let's take the CMB data and the axis of evil that's displayed in the film. First, I guess, can you talk a little bit about what the axis of evil is, which is explained in the film, but it's kind of quick, and I know some friends of mine had difficulty grasping it.
Yeah, you got to watch this film a number of times, and preferably you need to watch it with a good Google connection. It's not an easy film to get the first time, although you'll find that these concepts do begin to click. The fundamental thing that's got the cosmology community in a real uproar now is that under the assumptions of standard cosmology. And standard cosmology is general relativity in a particular type of set of solutions called the Friedman, Lemaitre, Robertson, Walker solutions, the FLRW solutions. These solutions depend upon two things being true. The universe is isotropic on its largest scales. In other words, there's no special directions, no up, no down, no left, no right. And the universe is homogeneous on its largest scales, which means no matter where you look from, there's no up or down or left or right. These two things must be true for standard cosmology to be true. And of course, that's very consistent with the idea of this Big Bang that was supposed to be, inflated out in all directions much faster than the speed of light to erase any trace of structure that might have existed at the beginning. It should be completely uniform on its largest scales, or average out to be isotropic over its largest scales and homogeneous. That is not what we are seeing. The largest object, the largest structure observable to us in the cosmos is the cosmic microwave background. And standard cosmology tells us this is the leftover radiation from the Big Bang itself. It permeates the entire universe. And when we look as far out as we can look in all directions, we get past the galaxies, we get past the quasars, and what we are left with is what they call this surface of last scattering, which they say was the very first light, the very first time that light became visible in the cosmos, about 300,000 years after the Big Bang. This surface of last scattering, where the photons separated and the space became transparent, left an imprint, a pattern. And this pattern is supposed to be isotropic, and it's supposed to be certainly defining no special directions, but it does. Very clearly. And they noticed this as far back as the late 90s. By 2004, the papers were being written about it. And it was so astounding that they actually sent another mission up in 2009 because they couldn't believe what their eyes were telling them, that this supposedly isotropic and completely random CMB, surface of last scattering, was actually highly organized, very planar, aligned, and it's pointing out a special direction across this entire universe, which is completely contrary to the assumptions of standard cosmology and of inflation, and critically of the Copernican principle itself, because it's not just any special direction. This special direction is aligned in completely unpredicted, and I think it's fair to say completely astonishing ways, with the ecliptic and equinox of the one place in the universe we know there are observers smart enough to build telescopes to look up and notice. This is absolutely stunning. The statistical likelihoods are about 1 in 100 million, which I think is rather statistic. Are you feeling lucky today, are you? This is a big deal, and we are determined not to allow this to be swept under the carpet. We are determined to bring the implications for the Copernican principle to light, and certainly there are a lot of folks who are not at all pleased that we have done so, and my attitude is, well, that's what a good duck's for.
Okay, so along that line of thought, with the CMB data, forgive me again for going back to him, but Dr. McAndrew also has an objection to that, which I found quoted in Jimmy Akin's Less Than Kind review in the National Catholic Register.
That wasn't a review, Ryan. That was not a review.
That's right. It actually depended mostly on David Paul.
That was an apologetics exercise. That was an exercise in editorial writing under the guise of a film review.
Right. Nevertheless, so he quotes McAndrew. I did find the original of it, but, quote, in that case, observers will see preferential clustering of galaxies as a function of redshift in concentric shells exactly centered on themselves from wherever in the universe they make the observation. Just like the recession of galaxies in a uniformly expanding universe always appears to be exactly centered on the observer. So, universal oscillations in the expansion rate would leave a signature in the redshift data precisely centered on the observer, wherever he is, unquote. And so in that
Did
would,
he actually? Could I ask you to repeat? Did
absolutely,
he
I'll do it again.
actually say variations in the oscillations in the expansion rate? Did he really say that? Could you read that back to me?
I'll
again,
read it
please?
one more time. It's quoted in, the reason I quoted Jimmy Akin in the Register is a lot of people will have read that, so they'll have that in their minds. But I did find the original. He says it in the original.
Please let me hear the part where he says oscillations. That's
Sure.
what I need.
So just like the recession of galaxies in a uniformly expanding universe always appears to be exactly centered on the observer, so universal oscillations in the expansion rate will leave a signature in the redshift.
Let's just stop right there, okay? So, the geocentrists are crackpots. But Jimmy Akin is proposing that the universe is speeding up and slowing down, and speeding up and slowing down, and speeding up and slowing down in its expansion rate as a way to explain why this doesn't put us at the center. Ryan, that's absurd. Does he have any possible basis for a physics that would turn on the expansion, then slow it down, then turn it back on? Of course not. It is a completely ad hoc attempt to render the obvious evidence of galaxies lying on preferred shells in redshift space around us by having an appeal to an epicycle that would have made Ptolemy completely embarrassed. Let's be honest here, Ryan. That's an absurdity. We can invent all kinds of ad hoc reasons why the galaxies are around us in shells. The fact is, the galaxies are around us in shells, and they shouldn't be under the assumptions of the Copernican principle. I just hope that people are able to see through the absurdity of that argument.
Okay, let's move on. What's next? So I wanted to go through some standard objections that are raised, or it's not usually an objection to, but simply an explanation of why they believe the Earth rotates, which are found usually in history books, science books. So the first one's all along, I'm going to try to break it down a bit. So if the Earth was not rotating, heated air would rise over the equator and move north and south, high above the Earth's surface. It would cool and sink down at the poles. The sinking air would...
Let me stop you, Ryan. On what possible basis could anyone make that objection without denying the theory of relativity in toto? Whatever forces are affecting the atmosphere by the rotation of the Earth must, under relativity, be exactly the same forces that would be affecting the atmosphere if the cosmos was rotating around a stationary Earth. The objection falsifies itself. Before that objection can be introduced, they have to go out and win the Nobel Prize and falsify general relativity. We're wasting our time on any kind of absolute space-based objection. They don't get to raise those kind of objections until they go get their Nobel Prize and falsify general relativity first.
All right, so let's look at... a lot of people, as you mentioned, Newtonian physics has more or less been eviscerated for 100 years, but a lot of people still don't understand that. A lot of people think that Einstein and Newton go together, and this is something I learned kind of with a shock when I had a class in philosophy of science in college, where they explained this, and I'd never heard that before. Yet people are still locked onto that idea that a larger body must necessarily, be orbited by smaller bodies and not vice versa. So, they're going to like the moons of Jupiter. A lot of people are still going to ask, how is it that the sun can go around the Earth even though it's vastly greater?
All that you have stated is the triumph of the Copernican principle in the minds of men. That's all that argument is. Hey, look, everything else, we have little things going around big things. We're a little thing. Why shouldn't we go around big things? That is simply the a priori assumption that the Earth is nothing special. We freely admit that geocentrism is false if the Earth is nothing special. We freely admit that if you can demonstrate, rather than just wave your hands and make plausible arguments about absolute space that's been falsified for 100 years, if you give us a scientific demonstration the Earth is in fact no different than all of these other bodies, congratulations. You've won. Guess what? They've been trying to do that for 400 years, and in fact, every experimental attempt to demonstrate that we're nothing special and we're going around the sun has returned the very puzzling result that we're not. So in the face of these experiments, and this is where relativity comes from, you have two choices. You can either say, well, gosh, who knew? I guess Bellman was right after all. We're not going around the sun. That's the testimony of the experiments. Or you can say, gosh, our physics must be wrong because we know the Earth is going around the sun, but our physics is telling us it's not. Let's fix the physics to explain why none of these experiments are showing that motion. That is exactly what relativity does.
Okay. So let's look at another objection. Oh, Coriolis Effect. Okay, that's another one that especially people with a little further study are going to say, well, what causes Coriolis Effect? Because it's not a force, same as centrifugal force, it's an effect. And if you were in orbit and you were, looking down at the Earth, you would see objects tending to move in straight lines, because they're being forced. Is that right? Someone outside the Earth would see objects tending to move in straight lines, but being forced into a curving path by the Earth's gravity. So if the Earth is not rotating, what causes this effect? Same thing as centrifugal force. We only see this because we're on a rotating Earth, supposedly.
But that's completely ridiculous, and that's been known to be ridiculous since 1921. The objector needs to go read Turing's very famous paper on the effects of distant rotating masses in Einstein's theory of gravitation. It is an exact solution using the Einstein equations to show that a Coriolis effect arises in any case where the Earth is taken as at rest and the masses of the universe are rotating around it. This is old. This is almost 100 years old. It's time that people started to understand the implications of their own theory. The answer is, ever since Mach, he recognized that the same forces that we attribute to the rotation of the Earth would arise if we took the Earth as at rest and the distant masses of the universe is rotating. Turing explicitly proved this using the Einstein equations in 1921. It's called the Lenz-Turing effect. They sent up gravity probe B based on that assumption. So all of these, I can't stress it enough. If any objection is put forth on the basis of absolute space, we must be rotating because this effect wouldn't be seen if we didn't. They're 100 years behind the curve, and they need to read Turing.
All right. So we'll throw out everything that's based on the same thing, and let's move back to Galileo, I suppose. Has the Church formally reversed its judgment on Galileo? A lot of people think that John Paul II actually, came and, said, "Oh, yeah, we got it wrong," and especially when he apologized for various persecutions of scientists and philosophers in a rather vague way. And so a lot of people say, "Yeah, the Church already fixed that. Isn't that Catholic belief now? Yeah, we accepted that."
Well, it's kind of interesting, is that. All I want to do is hold the Catholic faith. That's it. I am a layman who has been called to live in times of great confusion. Church. I humbly apologize if I have missed any way, shape, or form, and I am constantly willing to be corrected on this. I haven't been yet. The teaching to which you refer was an allocution by the Holy Father delivered and addressed not to the Catholic Church, but to a group of scientists. My understanding is if the Pope intends to bind me on a matter of faith or morals, he must address me and be addressing the Church and making it clear that he intends to address a matter of faith and morals. Certainly no matter of faith and morals can be addressed to a group of scientists. That is not an address to the Catholic Church. Therefore, doing my best to try and hold and profess the true faith, I notice that an absolutely authentic exercise of the Catholic magisterium occurred in 1633, promulgated and enforced by a pope, and it specifically bound the Church to reject the fundamental postulate of Galileo and Newton's system, which was that the sun was motionless at the center of the world. That was declared formally heretical. And it was declared formally heretical not because it was bad science. It was declared formally heretical because it was adjudicated to be directly contrary to the meaning of Scripture as that had been understood from the beginning of the church. And I know that no experiment has to this day ever changed that. Therefore, I consider myself personally bound and at liberty to uphold the unanimous consensus of the Fathers concerning the meaning of Scripture on this question. I am not a bishop. I do not imagine myself in any position to bind anyone else whatsoever. I am calling no one a heretic. I am attacking no one's faith. But I have an obligation to hold and defend and profess the Catholic faith to the very best of my ability. And pending correction on this, I hold to geocentrism as the correct meaning of Scripture and the completely unfalsified scientific option that is actually starting to look better and better and better in the face of our most recent experiments.
Okay, so along those lines then, if it's been declared in 1633 that the Copernican system is contrary to the faith, it's not just wrong scientifically, it's against the faith, a lot of people then are going to ask, well, then if geocentrism is true, and this is important for the Catholic faith, wouldn't I be a heretic for not accepting it?
It's not my call. I'm not a bishop. I would ask the same question about usury, which was even more emphatically and by many, many measures infallibly condemned, and we don't pay any attention to that at all either. Why is that? I don't know. It's a crazy thing. I don't understand. It's just we have been called to live at a time of great confusion. I am not a bishop. I am not here to tell anyone what they can or cannot believe, but I do insist on being respected in my honest, ongoing attempt to hold and profess the Catholic faith that comes to us from the apostles. No one has ever been condemned for holding to the Catholic teaching on usury, and no one has ever been condemned except by the self-appointed ecclesiastical KGB agents like Carl Keating and Jimmy Aiken and David Palm and Mark Shea. No one has ever condemned any Catholic for holding to geocentrism except these self-appointed ecclesiastical KGB agents, and I fear them in the slightest.
Right. So along those lines then, since you mentioned them, when the film was in post-production but hadn't yet appeared in theaters, there was a bit of an uproar, and it seemed that these self-appointed members of the Blogisterium in the church were determined to keep the principle out. So what exactly did they do to try to stop the principle?
It is one of the most grotesque and frankly evil campaigns that I have ever seen. The long-standing bad blood between Carl Keating and Bob Sungenis and David Palm and Mark Shea resulted in Mark Shea actually tweeting. He started this whole thing. It was Mark Shea put a tweet out to Lawrence Krauss and a tweet out to Michio Kaku basically saying, hey, did you guys know you've been tricked into a film where it makes you sound like you're supporting Geocentrism? And boy, that just launched it. That was too good of a story for anything as inconvenient as the facts to get in the way of. And it just spread like wildfire around the world. Now, this is a double-edged sword here. This was certainly intended to discredit the film and to kill the project. It failed. And in fact, it put us on the map. So I am reminded of the scriptural passage where it says, they have dug a pit for my feet and have fallen into it themselves. But the reprehensible misrepresentations of this film, the reprehensible lies that are spread all over Mark Shea's blogs, they are grotesque. He called us liars for Jesus. What a disgraceful. The fact that this man is employed by EWTN is a disgrace. And the fact that they hired Carl Keating's business partner to write the review of our film, it is absolutely disgraceful. Anyone who has seen the film can go back and read these years of rants and rages and realize that these men have completely destroyed their credibility. I am so happy to hear that Carl Keating resigned as the president of Catholic Answers yesterday. That's exactly what he should have done. And Mark Shea should be next. And we're going to be there's going to be some addressing of these slanders in the future, believe me.
So then, as a result of their campaign to stop the movie, several of the scientists involved said, "Oh," and they were filmed in the movie. Said, well, we were misled," and to the point where Lawrence Krauss is there claiming that, I never filmed that. They just took it off YouTube or something. And
it's hilarious, really.
Now, I could say, having seen the film, that not a single one of them, if you took those clips out of the principle, put it in some other context, nobody would be the wiser. Nobody would know anything about it. It was nothing they would be ashamed to say in public at all. Their viewpoint was perfectly represented. They were not cut and spliced to sound like geocentrists. And so, I'm just kind of baffled that they would then turn around, especially because you're holding the evidence, namely the release forms.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's astounding to me that they actually tried to make this fly. I guess they were just so freaked out, and the story was getting so big so fast that they decided that, they have the power to get their narrative out and have it be read by 20 million or 200 million people. And they just decided to go ahead and get it out there. One of the funniest things is to finally go through and onto our website and read the controversy page, where we take apart step by step by step, by claim, by claim, by claim, every one of these absurdities. It's one of the most interesting and hilarious media hoaxes that I can recall, because it's so obviously false. And it was so obviously maliciously initiated by Mark Shea, supposed Catholic, supposed voice of the new evangelization. There's such an interesting story here, Ryan. I'm telling you, we're just beginning to get our side of the story out, and everyone who hears it gets very interested. And when they see the film, they know that their intelligence has just been completely insulted by the media coverage of this film. It just goes to show you there's something about this question of our place in the cosmos. It explodes heads. I can't tell you why, but I can tell you it always has. It's changed entire civilizations before, and I believe it's about to do it again.
Okay. Speaking of exploding heads, traditional Catholics and conservative Catholics there's one issue which everyone agreed they did not like in the film. And with them, it's the most controversial part, and that's the case of Giordano Bruno. And in the film, it suggests he was burned as a heretic for his views that the universe was infinite in multiple worlds, which actually is an idea from Nicholas Acusa. But anyway, so not unlike Galileo, then he's been made as a martyr for science, and there's numerous film productions also that do that. PBS's series Empires on the Medici and Galileo, they make it look like he's a science martyr. Last year, what was it, Cosmos, had a depiction about 20 minutes of their film on Bruno. And the tricky thing that I'm having a problem with is Bruno was not a scientist. In fact, he didn't do any science. He was a magician, a philosopher. He practiced witchcraft. He denied the Christian faith as such. He denied Christ's divinity, the Trinity, the virginity of Our Lady. In England, he got chased out of England as he was associated in John Dee's circle, and he made too many enemies very quick. Even in anti-papal Venice is the one that hands him over to the Roman Inquisition. So this isn't really a scientist that's getting burned.
It's such a beautiful point. I'm so glad that you brought this up. Galileo was the official proto-martyr of science until Bob Sungenis published Galileo Was Wrong and gave the first English translation of the letter Galileo wrote just before his death to Rinuccini. It's a beautiful letter where he explicitly explicitly rejects the evidence that Rinuccini had sent him, which he thought established certainly the correctness of the Copernican system. Once you read that letter, pardon me, you have no doubt that Galileo died in the bosom of the Catholic faith, first of all, and you can't use him as the scientific proto-martyr anymore. Now, these guys are smart. They know that. So they needed a new scientific proto-martyr, and guess who they dug up? They dug up a Kabbalistic weirdo, a complete, like you say, he couldn't find any place in Europe that he couldn't get chased out of. he was a nut bird, and I love the fact that in Romano Amerio's great book on the title, Ryan, Iota Unum.
Yeah, that's right.
Iota Unum. He calls Bruno the originator of this foggy kind of language that we hear in all of our theology these days. He calls it circuitarism. In a certain sense, it can be felt that under a certain viewpoint, in other words, these foggy kind, which is the exact opposite of the traditional precision, consistency, and intellectual rigor of Catholic philosophy, metaphysics, and theology. Bruno invented that, and he got himself into some serious trouble. Now, let's see how this relates to this film and how it's got all the trads upset about that scene. I think they're wrong. I think they've got it exactly wrong, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
To me, it's one of the best scenes in the movie. It's very dramatic because you have Bruno being brought to the pyre, and Michio Kaku says, Giordano Bruno talked about an infinite space, and he starts telling us, it is one of the most fascinating passages in the whole film. If there are other worlds, are there people on these worlds? If so, do they have a savior? If so, do they have saints? How many trinities are there? 1 billion popes? 1 billion? So Michio says, okay, science needs a new proto-martyr, and they're going to make it Bruno. So he says, Bruno was burned alive in the streets of Rome just for saying that there are other worlds out there. And if there are other worlds out there, are there people on them? If there are, do they have saints? Do they have a pope? How many trinities are there? 1 billion popes, 1 trillion saints. The boy goes crazy.
Isn't there one pope enough?
Yeah, exactly. So, but I left it in, and I left it in for this reason. Because if you really put yourself back in the position of the Pope, it's against 1600, and you see the implications for this worldview. This Copernican worldview is spreading, and it is being rapidly deployed into the intelligentsia of Europe. And Bruno has pointed out its logical end, which is the absolute demotion of the earth, the place of the incarnation of Christ, the absolute falsification of the Catholic faith as it has come to us from the apostles. So, what are you going to do if you're the Pope? Are you going to allow this guy to continue to spread these ideas, or are you going to try and set an example that will let everyone know that these ideas are corrosive to the very faith itself? I submit that the trads who are attacking that scene want to have it both ways, and I'll tell you why. And you put them right up against the wall and say, would you burn Bruno today? It's about 50-50. 50% of them say they would. 50% of them say they wouldn't. Well, guess what? If you say you wouldn't, you've got no complaint against Michio Kaku whatsoever. Right? Now, for the ones who are consistent and who say they would, I submit that he was burned precisely because of what Michio Kaku said. Because the popes understood the implications of this Copernican worldview taken to its logical conclusion, and Bruno pointed them out 400 years before we finally heard the word multiverse for the first time. The popes were very smart. They understood that these ideas would be the end of Christendom. They attempted to stop them. We can all make a prudential judgment. I personally think it's a mistake to burn people at the stake, but I am not in a position to put myself back into the context of 1600 when it was possible we might have been able to save Christian civilization. What I can tell you for sure is that if you do not burn Bruno at the stake, you are going to get exactly what we've got today. And they prevailed. Bruno was the proto-martyr. Because it's not science. The multiverse is not science. The multiverse is pure metaphysics. The Copernican principle is pure metaphysics. If you surrender the Catholic view of the cosmos, of the entire cosmos arranged around us as the place of the incarnation of the Son of God for the redemption of the lost children of Adam, you end up with a multiverse. Have the courage of your convictions, trads. One way or the other. You can't have both.
So essentially then, he's being the... So yes, he was burned for his false doctrines, his rejections of Christ, but so you're saying that these all flow from his view of essentially the proto-multiverse and of other worlds, and since it flows from that, that's why it was necessary. Although it was a belated decision, because as Angelo Marcatti points out in his book Il sommario del processo di Giordano Bruno, Bruno was kept 7 years in the inquisitorial prisons, and he had 40 Julii, which in Rome at that time was quite a bit of money. And 10 was enough to live well for a month. And he had writing and everything. Bellarmine met with him, and Bellarmine actually, according to his biographer Broderick, got him to recant most of his stuff. He set down some philosophical points that Bellarmine decided best left alone as long as he adhered to the rest. But then he lapsed, and that's when Clement VIII made the decision to burn him.
That's exactly right. I mean, at the end of the day, you either defend Christian civilization or you defend the idea of intellectual freedom and religious freedom. And I'm sorry, guys, you can't have it both ways. The popes at that time were attempting to quash a rapidly expanding worldview which they considered to be a mortal threat to Christianity itself. Guess what? They didn't stop it, and it turns out they were right. It was a mortal threat to Christianity itself. We taught a very different worldview back when we had unity and commitment to the scriptures, to the inerrant truth of the scriptures as interpreted by the fathers. The earth is the first object created. Genesis 1:1, guys, read it sometime. There's no sun there. The earth is certainly not orbiting the sun in Genesis 1:1. No father believed that the earth was orbiting the sun. The idea was ludicrous to them. We have, in very important ways, really adopted the mental thoughts, habits, and philosophies of the successors of Giordano Bruno, and the consequences are there. I'm just pointing them out. I thought that what Michio Kaku said in that film was a brilliant summary of just exactly why the church really did burn him. The trads who have a problem with that, they either have a problem because they did burn him, or they have a problem because they disagreed with the Catholic faith in the first place. At the end of the day, the Pope saw it, they tried to stop it, they failed, and we have got to live with the consequences now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Very good. I think that explains that element, although I know some people still aren't going to be happy. But I think part of the issue is it wasn't more nuanced in the film, is that they don't... I mean, we're not strictly talking about what Michio Kaku said, which I thought was brilliant, because I thought it was exactly right. In fact, some things paraphrase something I think I read quoted to Bruno, but I never tracked down the original. More importantly, though, the fact that it makes it look as though he's burned strictly for a scientific position, disconnected from the consequences of faith. The way that it plays out in the animation and the narration, etc.
Let me address that. I mean, look, I fully agree that a fascinating film could be made about Giordano Bruno, just like a fascinating film could be made about geocentrism. But my film is an examination of the Copernican principle, and all of these historical events are treated really with respect to their relevance to that subject. I certainly never intended to give any impression that this was a thorough and complete treatment of why Bruno was burned. I also completely reject the claim that it's a false or misleading expression of why he was killed. I felt that Michio Kaku correctly assessed the implications of Bruno's thought, and I thought that the popes would have correctly understood the implications of Bruno's thought. There were plenty of people out there who didn't get burned, who believed everything Bruno believed, but Bruno pushed it. And the popes had to make a decision, and they made that decision. And again, I would just say, the scene is not intended to be a definitive academic treatment of the subject of Giordano Bruno. The scene is meant to point out that it was the Copernican principle into existence at this point in Europe, and the popes recognized logically where it would lead and attempted to stop it. Certainly, trads, I think, are a little bit put off by the fact that it makes the church look bad. Well, why does it make the church look bad? I think it really comes down to, was he supposed to be burned or not? Have the courage of your convictions, trads. Do you want to stop those kinds of ideas? Okay. Well, then what the popes did was they burned this man at the stake. You could support that or you could oppose that. Clearly, in my view, it didn't work. It was maybe at the time it might have made sense, but it clearly failed, and it is now used by the Michiokakus and multiverse theorists of this world as the proto-martyr that they lost in Galilee.
Right. And that would be consistent, like I said, with Bellarmine's biographer Broderick. His judgment was that Clement VIII should have simply left it alone, let him rot in the inquisitorial jail, not let him, become the future martyr, which of course they couldn't have foreseen. So, I mean, we could, of course, talk about, whether right or wrong to burn people. Obviously, from a modern perspective, I think it's horrific. But from the times that they lived in, I mean, that was consistent with Catholic, Protestant practice. It was done by the state. Of course, in the Papal States, the Pope and the state did the same thing. But everywhere else, Calvin burned people in Geneva, Luther burned people in Wittenberg. In England, I mean, for goodness sakes, they're burning people in 1790. It's our forgotten memory in Europe, but they're still burning people in 1790 in England.
Gotta understand, Ryan, this was meant to be a sign. What was the purpose of burning heretics? It was a sign. These guys were burned in a way that the oxygen would have been taken away from where they were at the center of the pyre long before they would have suffocated to death. The idea that this was meant to torment them is false, but it's a sign to the people. It is a sign that heresy leads to hell, that the simple burning you're seeing here is just a sign. What awaits the unrepentant heretic is this for an eternity. Now, we might think that's crazy. Well, maybe it is. Maybe we're the ones who are crazy. All I can tell you is that Bruno is a sign. Bruno is a sign of a great change about to descend upon the world. And I hope that the principle is also a sign and a countersign, a sign of a great change that is about to descend upon the world, run by the descendants of Bruno, who have leaped completely through the looking glass into the multiverse. I mean, it's really ironic when you think about it. Natural science begins with the natural philosophers walking away from, the old saw is, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin?
Right.
Okay. So they want to limit themselves to what they can observe, test, and measure. It's very successful. Isn't it ironic now that at the end of the enterprise, we have them jumping through the looking glass and proposing that we spend perhaps the next couple of centuries arguing about how many multiverses we can never possibly observe under any possible aspect of the scientific method. The ironies here are rich. We happen to live at a critical moment in history where, just as Bruno was a sign, I hope that the information we are bringing to the public and the principle will be a sign that pendulum has started to swing back again. As a matter of fact, just today, Science Magazine came out. Look at the cover of Science Magazine this week. Is there a crisis in physics? Oh, yes, there is. We told them in the trailer, there is a crisis. We said that a year and a half ago. Now we're out in theaters. I just hope people come see this film because we are a little ahead of ourselves. We're a little ahead of the curve here, and we're asking our audience to confront things that are very challenging intellectually. But believe me, in 5 years, if you don't see the principle now, you will not have gotten the early warning of what's coming.
How many multiverses can we balance at the head of a pin?
Yeah.
Well, then let's move.
Yeah.
What's that? Oh, I think we lost you again. You still there?
I am. Are you there?
Okay, yep. So every once in a while we get it get fuzzy or cut out. But all right, so last point, or second to last point actually. Some people would say, all right, well, maybe all this is true, but you're making the church look ridiculous. People despise the church enough today without adding this on. And as a distributist, I experience this a lot when I talk about usury. Yeah, we mentioned that before, the Church's condemnation of usury. De fide non definita in the medievals, the Fathers, and then defined by the ordinary magisterium under Pope Benedict XIV. And this is, clearly taught Catholic doctrine, and there's no way out of it. Yet everyone is trying to get their way out of it and say, "Oh, you're nuts! You don't understand economics." And they say the church is going to look ridiculous. It'll look like she doesn't understand economics. Although after 2008, you have to question whether the economists really understand economics as well. So, nevertheless, what do you say to this argument that, well, all right, so geocentrism is true. We are really special in the universe, but we should leave that for another day because we have to concentrate on abortion and gay marriage and contraception and the whole culture of death, and the church will be the laughingstock and nobody will pay any attention if we deal with these silly questions in cosmology, which mere laymen, we're not ready for that, right? Some people do say this a lot when we bring up this point.
With the greatest respect, and I do understand, that is the strategy which has lost the West to the Catholic faith. You are a pragmatist. You are a political strategist. You are trying to say, oh no, we can't win this fight, so let's go in that fight. I am afraid that you have already lost. Wake up, please. Look around you. Look at the catastrophe that is befalling Western civilization. We have one job in this world, and that is to proclaim the truth. We have one job in this world, and that is to assist the various areas of civilization when they start drifting off into pure insanity. And unfortunately, it's never popular to do that. I just can't imagine Christ saying, guys, this whole baptism thing, it's a little tough. So listen, let's just focus on feeding the poor. That'll work better. I think there's an underlying sense of pragmatism, and I believe the Copernican principle is the foundational root metaphysical idea that is inimical to the Catholic view of the cosmos, which proceeds from the apostles and founders. I'm not asking anybody to join me in this fight. I'm quite ready to take it on. What I do ask is that they please don't shoot at me. I'm getting enough bullets from the opposition. At least come and see the film and think about it, because it's just possible that I'm right and that I have identified the root idea of all these other symptoms that you're hacking away at and losing. If you get to the root, and you can win. And we can, because the science on this is very, very strong now. The Copernican principle is in deep trouble. Instead of fighting and hacking away at the branches, let's go for the root and see if we can persuade humanity that we have a better basis upon which to make sense out of this vast cosmos of ours. That's how you convert the world, not by hacking away at the branches and saying, oh, no, don't do anything controversial. I have to reject that premise out of hand.
Excellent. So then the very last thing is DVD. When is the DVD going to be available?
Okay, we are right on the verge, man. We're dancing on the sword here. We did incredible numbers in LA last 3 weeks. It's just amazing what we did with no advertising, nothing behind us at all. But the people came in, they're still coming. We just got held over for a third week, incredibly, in Orange County. So we are going to try one time to somehow scrape together a few handfuls of rice and throw this film out into as many cities as we can get. Please come. Please tell your friends to come. Please support it. Please tell your friends to support it, because we are right at the verge of a breakout. I distributed today, theater owners are calling for this film from all over the country. The audiences are telling them they want to see it. This film could break out. If I had the money right now, I could put this film in 100 theaters around the country next weekend. I don't have the money, so we'll have to do it more slowly and cleverly. But I want you to know we are sitting down to address the issue of DVD and streaming with very, very, very cool companies that really want to. We're not going to make you guys wait. We're going to find a way to get this film to you, both theatrically and online and through DVD. Give us a little time here, but the interest is now on this film. We're going to be able to get this film to you worldwide.
Excellent. Rick Delano, thank you for your time. It was a pleasure.
Ryan, can I just close by saying that you are one of my very, very, very favorite Catholic bloggers. You know, you and I have agreed on most things, disagreed on a few, but I have had such a great pleasure in reading your blog over the years. Long before I ever got myself into this, I was reading your blog, and it was very important in giving me a good foundation. And I really just want you to know how much I appreciate all you've put into that blog. It's a great blog.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.